Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Paulie. Nice to speak to you.
Absolutely, and the voice you can hear, guys, is Mr. Keith Bertschin, who joins us for a game of my life. We're calling this one Bertschin 82, Hungry Like the Wolf, because, Keith, you were hungry like the wolf, and in that game, you were like a salmon that jumped up and a kestrel when you headed that ball into the back of the net. You needed a point for promotion. 3 years earlier, you needed a point for promotion. You got promotion with Birmingham City. You got promoted with Norwich. We're going to look at that game in more depth a little bit later on in the podcast, but I want to put some flesh on the bone, and we're going to talk about the season. But first, before that season started, you were a Birmingham City player. How did the move to Norwich come about in the August of 1981?
Well, I think I'd had a lot of injury, and if I was really honest, it was the first time that my form had, varied slightly.
Yeah.
And I'd had kind of a season of injury, and I'd had a couple of really, really good season, and it was one of those ends of season where something always goes mad. I mean, we had the same with Birmingham when they played Luton, the last game of the season, when it was all at stake, and the last game for Norwich, everything was all at stake, and it never goes perfectly. And if the truth be known, we didn't win the game. However, an old friend of mine, Trevor Wymark, at the time was finishing his career at Grimsby, and he ended up scoring against Leicester. And he was one of my true heroes growing up at Ipswich. He was an absolutely brilliant player. And he'd managed to score for Grimsby against Leicester, at Leicester, which actually catapulted us into the first division, even though we'd been beaten,
So you were still at Birmingham in August 81.
Yes.
Ken Browne was the manager of Norwich. How did the move come about? Did Ken approach Birmingham, or was Jim looking for money? Because Birmingham were always looking to sell players for money.
I think it might have been the money.
Yeah.
I think perhaps because I'd had a quiet season, maybe managers lose a little bit of confidence in you.
Yeah.
And if anything, that probably gave me a little bit of a kick up the backside. And I went to Norwich and came back to Birmingham. And, I scored twice against Birmingham. And John Dean scored twice,
Yeah.
So for Norwich, an ex-Villa player and an ex-Birmingham player put four up against, Birmingham, who were the home team. And it was a very, very good win,
Absolutely. And that was the season after, wasn't it, when you got promoted back to the first division? Did you have any trepidation with the move? Because at Birmingham you were in the first division. Norwich City had got relegated the season before and were starting life in the second division. Like a lot of teams, there's a necessity to get straight back up. You keep the players together in the olden days. But Martin had left. He had in his clause in his contract that he could trigger it and leave if Norwich City got relegated. So he did. He went to Manchester City. He did come back later on in that season. We're going to talk about that because I think that was a very pivotal moment. But the season started in South Yorkshire and it ended in South Yorkshire as well, Keith. Rotherham, first game of the season. It got off to a good start, but then you got beat 4-1, didn't you?
We did. I mean, it's very difficult. You have all the stats and figures.
I'll lead you through it. Yeah.
It's a bit cloudy sometimes.
Yeah, sure.
Game by game, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember I absolutely loved Norwich.
Yeah.
And I suppose I wasn't expecting to enjoy it quite as much as I did.
Yeah.
And I bought a really nice home down there, and I was very happy down there. But I think, dare I say, I might have had a flashpoint from time to time, and it normally ended me with leaving with a club. Yeah. I'm sure that happened at Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And I think Jim Smith was contemplating bringing in Neil Watmore
Yes.
to play with Frank, because I think they played at Bolton together.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And so I thought, well, you know, if he's losing confidence in me, there's no real point in me being there.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you're quite right. Norwich, Ken Browne requested for me. Well, he requested, could I go down and see him? And so did the manager. I'm just trying to think of the manager at Portsmouth.
Oh, right. Okay.
And all of a sudden, the Portsmouth thing went away. So I went down to Norwich, and when I met Ken, I was really happy to sign for him. I didn't know the area particularly, even though I've been at Ipswich, but that's still 50, 60 mile away.
Yes.
And so it was a bit of a new adventure. And I guess in those days, I kind of enjoyed a new adventure and a new challenge, probably.
Absolutely, and it was a bit of a different ball game as well because plastic pitches had just come out, hadn't they? It was also the first season of 3 points for a win rather than the two previously.
Well, I think that was kind of one of the hallmarks for me to sort of re-galvanise the game. I think the game might have been going through a little bit of a flat spot.
Yeah,
And I think when they decided to do the 3 points, changed all the subs over, and they were just trying to modernise the game a little bit. And those little changes, I think, kind of galvanised the game a little bit and gave people a fresh interest.
absolutely. Off the pitch, Keith, there was a lot going on in 1981. Sadly, in the September of 1981, Bill Shankly died. Only Fools and Horses premiered on the BBC. Crazy George started the Mexican wave in America, and Spain became members of NATO. Mohammed Ali also had his last fight when he got beat by Trevor Berbick. So off the pitch there was a lot going on. What was Keith Bertschin doing off the pitch in 1981? We knew what you was doing at Birmingham. You were in the Rum Runner with Frank and the boys. But what was the nightlife like in Norwich?
Well, rather interestingly, um, it was a little slower pace. It was
Yeah.
a little bit slower pace at Norwich, but I'd run into a friend of mine. Well, I say he became a friend. He had a really nice restaurant in Norwich. It was called the Pink Elephant,
Okay.
and me and my wife really, really enjoyed it there, and became very friendly with the couple that owned it. Yeah, and we spent a lot of time there just having a bite to eat. So it was a different kind of night out, and maybe I was just getting a little older, but thoroughly enjoyed good food and a couple of drinks, maybe once in the week and once at weekends.
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt. It's a good way of relaxing. You've done that once for Birmingham City with Frank when you went out and enjoyed a meal with Alan Kirbysley before you played Chelsea. You did play Chelsea, of course, because Chelsea were in the second division that season. Some of the TV programmes that started, Falcons Crest and Dallas, also Bergerac was very popular on the TV, and Only Fools and Horses, as I just alluded to, started. What a great series. 1981 had an awful lot, and it was the start of a new decade as well, wasn't it? The game of football was changing.
Well, it was quite sad because
Mm,
TV programs I don't remember much these days,
no.
but I remember all of them. So, of course, a lot of our time was spent indoors, either preparing for a game or recovering from one. So you're quite right. They were really good series. And to be sensible because of our job, you end up, looking forward to the TV because it keeps you out of trouble and out of
Yeah.
mischief, and it helps you relax.
There were some fantastic songs in 1981 as well, and to this day, just can't get enough is a terrace anthem for lots of football clubs. Certainly, Nottingham Forest play it whenever they win. But what other music was you into? There was 18 number ones that year, Keith, during the football season. Just looking down the list, My favourite band, the Jam, Town Called Malice, was number one.
Yeah, I like that.
The biggest selling song of 1981 was "Don't You Want Me" for the Human League. And music was changing as well, wasn't it? The style of music was changing. The guitar bands were really going out, and the synthesized music was coming in. But you'd already seen that happening through Broad Street and the Rum Runner, because Duran Duran were the kings of the road. Certainly that part of the road in Birmingham, wasn't they?
Well, I remember being in Spain. I'm sure it was probably Ibiza.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of young kids who were in a, dare I say, discotheque. That sounds
Yes.
very dated.
They're great places.
Where we were, they were open all night.
Yeah.
And there were two young kids, and I think they were trying to get a record launched. Later on that evening, we bumped into them, and we were in a discotheque that filled up with water. About 3 or 4 in the morning. There was a kind of a guarded off area of about 3 foot, and it must have been like waterproof-ish. And anyway, it started to fill up with water. We thought we were drunk. Anyway, I bumped into this one kid and knocked him, and he fell in the water, and I picked him up. It was George Michael.
Blimey.
Yeah.
Wham.
And they were releasing an album. I think it was their first album. I think it was called Hotel Tropicana.
Right.
And yeah, they were both over there. So funny who you bump into.
Funny who you knock into the water as well, Keith. You nearly drowned one of the greatest pop icons of the 80s in Ibiza.
I'd have really been cross with myself, I got to tell you.
Absolutely. Charlton Athletic, you played Charlton in the Cup. I'm bringing that game up because, again, TV was changing slightly. There was conversations that they wanted to take it on to another level. In the mid-80s, there was talk about ITV. We started having more than the FA Cup final and the odd England match live on TV. And that was pretty much the advent then in 1992 of the Premier League. But Alan Mullery was manager of Charlton in the League Cup game that you played, and it was mic'd up. It was one of the first of its time where you had the microphone on the manager in the dugout and you watch what he was going through. And that again was groundbreaking, wasn't it? Have you any memories about the cup tie that you played and the cameras being there for that game?
You know what? I wouldn't have known it was Alan Mullery.
Yeah.
But I watched him as a young boy when he played for Tottenham.
Yeah.
And he was like one of my heroes. That team, over the years, we'd go to Tottenham one week and Arsenal the next when I was just a young boy. And I saw some great players. And obviously in that team with Mullery was like Alan Gilzine and Jimmy Greaves, Jimmy Robertson, Pat Jennings. When it's one of my greatest moments when I managed to stick one past Pat Jennings from quite a long way out. And by this time he was playing for Arsenal. And probably one of my proudest moments, only because I was a super fan, because I thought he was such a fantastic goalkeeper. I think he actually said to me at half time, "I'd appreciate if you didn't do that again," which was just typical of him. And of course, I was just happy to be on the same pitch as him,
It was a fantastic goal, one of your great goals. If I'm going to roll the clock forward to about 1990-91, that goal you scored for Aldershot was pretty smoky as well, mate.
Well,
delicious.
I really was at the end of my career.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was a header or one I hit with my left foot.
It was your left foot, mate.
Yeah.
The one I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes they drop for you and old habits die hard and you just hit it. More often than not, they went over the stadium. But one or two, hit the target. And so, yeah, more lucky than anything else. But if you don't take a shot, you don't score, do you? So
you certainly don't.
Anywhere, 25, 30 yards out, if I thought I could let rip, I probably would try and do so, you know.
Absolutely. Did you let rip on your first visit to the plastic pitch at QPR? Have you any memories of that, Keith? October the 10th it was. You played QPR away. You got beat 2-0 in the league. But they'd just installed a plastic pitch, hadn't they, in those early days?
I do remember the first game. I think people like Simon Stainrod,
Yeah,
there were a lot of good. They had a lot of good footballers, and they whizzed the ball around
yeah,
really quickly. And it was almost unfair because they knew how to play on it, and we really didn't.
yep, yep.
And so we felt a little bit aggrieved. And I think we went back the promotional year. We went back the promotional year when we got promotion. And I think we may have got beat 1-0 because Alan Kirbishley remembers particularly. He tried to play a clever little pass that didn't actually work out, which got intercepted. And they went through and scored.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Smith had words to say that I can't explain or I can't repeat. But needless to say, things weren't great. And I think it was a week or so later we were playing West Ham in London, and we managed to score. I think I scored the second goal in injury time, and it was a massive win for us. And I think it was the game before Notts County, which was another, incredibly exciting year at Birmingham, as was Norwich, that the year we're talking about.
Because you did have two promotions. There wasn't back to back, but the one was 79-80 season, and then the other one was 81-82 season. And as I alluded to earlier, you needed a draw on the final days. How difficult is that when you're going into a game that you need a draw? You don't play for a draw. Surely you go for the jugular and you try and win. And sometimes if you fall a little bit short, you still get what you needed and what you came for.
Well, we also had a very, very excitable manager, Jim Smith.
Yes.
And he was very ambitious. And he absolutely would give you anything if you won. And he'd take it all back off you if you lost. However, it was all very clear. Win, no trouble. Lose, big trouble. So at least the message was fairly clear. And although we'd messed up a little bit at QPR, it was only a week or so later, I think we went to West Ham and won. And then that put us in really good position. I think we had to either win or draw against Luton to get back into the first division. So it wasn't all smooth, plain sailing, to say the least. But we had some really good players, Frank, Archie, Colin Todd were the older type of players. And then the younger ones were likes of Mark Dennis, Kevin Dillon, Kirbishley, myself, Alan Ainscough. We had some really, really good players. And, it was a great time to remember back on because it was all so exciting,
Absolutely.
And it all ended out with the right result, which was the most important thing of all.
Absolutely, a 3-3 draw with Notts County on that final day. I remember that very well. I was there. What was your teammates like at Norwich? What was the dynamics like there? That was the squad that you had at Birmingham. But what were the Norwich team like? Again, getting relegated. I'm guessing that morale wasn't that great. And how did Ken differ from Jim? Jim was very fiery, and at Birmingham it was very fiery. What was Ken Browne like as a manager and your players, your teammates?
Well, the one thing I would say about the two of them that was a bit similar, they could pick a player.
Yes.
And I think it was in those days. It was less tactical. Obviously, you had a way of playing.
Mm-hmm.
And Norwich had a certain style, and Ipswich and Birmingham had a certain style that weren't miles apart, to be absolutely honest.
Yeah.
But I talked about the older brigade in Birmingham. Well, if you like, we had equally fabulous players who were in their evergreen stage. We had Martin O'Neill.
Yep.
We had Mick Shannon, who was a really great guy. And he was a wonderful advert for enjoying football. And there was no one loved playing more than him.
Mm-hmm.
So it was Martin O'Neill, Mick Shannon. Mick Maguire was beginning to get evergreen. He was a great lad in the dressing room and a great guy on the pitch in midfield. He was a terrific boy. And of course then we had my old pal John Dean from Aston Villa. Dave Watson and Steve Walford were youngsters, but doing really, really well. We had Chris Woods in goal. It was a really, really good side. And Greg Downs and Paul Haylock were two fullbacks. So, as I say, it's like, I don't know how many years ago, 40 years ago, but I can still reel off the team as if it was yesterday.
Absolutely. Greg Downs, didn't you used to call him the milk tray man?
I think one or two people called him Duck Downs. But no, he was a good lad, Greg, and he ended up, I think, going into the police force, as we all did something different after football in those days. But no, he could play. Goodness me, he could play. And we had a brilliant left winger, but it was the white Dave Bennett.
Yes.
Not to be mixed up with the Coventry lad.
Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously Dave and Gary Bennett. I played with Gary in Sunderland.
Yes.
But yeah, the Norwich Dave Bennett was a really skillful player, and I enjoyed his company very much. And he actually probably put the ball on my head for the goal that you talked about, Sheffield Wednesday.
How about the fella Barham? He was the other winger, wasn't he? Whenever I've seen clips, when I've seen clips of him, he looked a bit useful on his day.
Very good.
Yeah.
And I think he played once or twice for England.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a handful. He was, he was quick. He moved the ball quick. He had great technique. We had a good team. I mean, I was very, very fortunate because I loved all the Birmingham teams that I really feel that the first year, 18 months, there was one team at Birmingham. And then by the time I got back from injury during my second season, which would actually have then been my third season at Birmingham, we had almost a completely new side.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough to play in both. And then going to Norwich, again, it was a new set of players, but equally talented. And it meant that we could have a certain amount of success.
Did you? I mean, you forged that great partnership with Dixie. Of course, he was a Villa legend in 76-77 season. Partnered up front with both Brian Little and Andy Gray, and I think between them scored over 60 goals. They were quite fantastic. Dixie was quite fantastic, but it was in the December of 81. You was already there, wasn't you? And then Dixie arrived. What was that dynamic like between you and him? Did you know each other from obviously the Birmingham City and Aston Villa derbies and living in the area? Yeah,
we did, and I think he'd had a little bit of an awkward time at West Brom.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
he'd gone for a lot of money.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
and I think he actually approached Norwich a little bit like I did. It was a breath of fresh air.
Yeah,
it was out of the way,
and
it probably wasn't quite as intense as Midlands football.
Yeah,
and to be quite honest, I remember when he came and we were playing a friendly game because everywhere was snowed off, and we'd got him sort of. It must have been around about Christmas, January time.
Yeah.
And in this friendly game, I think he scored 3 or 4 goals. And everyone went, oh, my God, who is this kid, And to be quite honest, he didn't look back from there. And he came up with a lot of goals for Norwich. And he played it was quite brave, really, of Mel Machin, or Ken Browne and Mel Machin. They played like 3 centre forwards. They played me and Shannon, and they played Dixie as a number 10.
Yeah.
Who he'd do a certain amount of work in midfield, but was always looking to join us in the box quite quickly.
Yeah.
And he got a lot of goals that particular year. And and became very, very, very popular. And he was a really good player, I have to say. He was a really good player. He did used to annoy me though, because I'd get through and probably avoid 2 or 3 tackles, and then finally get smashed. Then he'd pick the ball up and just knock it in the goal. And as he used to walk past me, with my shins hanging out, my shin pads, he'd say, "Oh, another goal for me then." I've had the ball for about 20 minutes. I'm about to knock it in, and I get smashed. And he runs up behind me, kicks it in. He goes, "Oh, another goal for me." And he thought he was the funniest person in the world, and I'm laying there like half knackered. But no, he was great to anticipate where he thought the ball would land. And for 2 or 3 seasons, he was very, very confident at getting sort of, I don't know, 15, 20 goals.
Yes.
Which made him very valuable.
Absolutely. A player that was very valuable for West Bromwich Albion, you went there in the fifth round of the FA Cup in your promotion season, was Cyril Regis. And the goal that Big Cyril scored on that day, 13th of February 1982, was goal of the season. Again, another Midlands legend who was a bit tasty, wasn't he, Big Cyril?
Oh, and I remember he turned Dave Watson.
Yeah, he did.
And David was playing particularly well and went on to have a million seasons at Everton and sort of became folklore or legendary over there. But Cyril was very, very strong, and he was a great friend of mine, as it turned out. And I was very, very fond of him. And no, he was a proper bloke and a proper player. And at the time, it was very in vogue. There was him, Laurie Cunningham, Brendan Batson. And the one thing they all had in common, they were all good players.
Yes.
Really good players. And interestingly enough, it was quite good, really. I hadn't realised until I got there. But on a Saturday night, we'd somehow cruise into Birmingham, and there'd be a few of the Coventry lads there. There'd be a few West Brom lads. And in the end, we're all talking and having a drink and talking about the weekend, talking about the Saturday games. And, oh, no, it was, don't get me wrong. It was a little bit more fierce when we were playing against each other.
Of course.
But when it was finished, the amount of times we bumped into, the various players from all the Midlands clubs that incidentally were all in the first division at the time, and I think Andy might have opened a club around about that time. So we'd all meet there.
Yeah.
And so it was a real den of iniquity for the Midlands teams and a good night had by all.
And I guess that's the difference in the Midlands. We had so many teams in close proximity. The local derby, of course, for Norwich City was Ipswich. What other games did you play that was, that got a bit on them, gets a bit feisty? It was a little bit of a local derby, not too close, but still, the fans were up for it because there's nothing like a local derby. And when you're playing in Birmingham or London, you are a little bit spoilt for the amount of clubs that are close to you.
Well, I remember it wasn't Norwich to begin with, but I remember one of my first derbies was, I'm sure someone would say, well, you must have played Ipswich and Norwich. Well, I can't remember because I was just on the fringe of the Ipswich team and
yes,
I was younger in those days. But, the first Birmingham derby between the Villa and Birmingham was a huge game, and I had no idea that it was the size of a game that what it was. And it was the first sort of idea I had that, wow, Midlands is a really, really big footballing area, because I had no idea that the derby was so huge. And there was never much football played, but it was always about the result.
Absolutely. They are, by definition, not the greatest spectacles to watch,
Not always,
but
no.
by do they the challenges are flying in, and they are very, very difficult.
And to listen to the rest of this podcast, head on over to www.patreon.com/SRB Media. Thank you.